April 23rd, 1974. Altoona, Pennsylvania. The block between the railroad station and the Greyhound office was already awake, though the morning had not decided whether it wanted to be warm or cold. A thin spring fog hung over the tracks. Diesel smoke drifted under the viaduct. The first commuter buses hissed at the curb, and the men who had been sleeping upright in the station benches stepped outside with paper cups of coffee in their hands, blinking like they had come out of a tunnel. Captain Frank Wallace of the Pennsylvania State Police stood across from the Maple Yard Cafe and looked at the sign above the door. The paint had faded into a tired green. One corner of the plywood had warped. The word Maple leaned downward, as if the whole place had grown weary of holding itself up. There were 3 booths inside, a counter with 7 stools, a coffee urn that never seemed to cool, and a front window clouded by years of steam and cigarette smoke. On an ordinary day, no one would have stopped to study it. It was just another cheap counter near the station, the kind of place where a traveling salesman could get a bowl of stew, a slice of white bread, and a refill, without anyone asking where he had been. Wallace had driven in from Harrisburg after midnight. He had not slept. His eyes were red, and the collar of his shirt rubbed against 2 days of stubble. In the inside pocket of his coat was a search warrant, signed by a Blair County judge less than an hour earlier. In the other pocket was a photograph of Officer Kevin Moore, 24 years old, a municipal patrolman from Erie, who had vanished 6 days before while traveling to a training class outside Harrisburg. In the photograph, Moore was smiling in a pressed uniform, his cap tucked under one arm. He was engaged to a woman named Janet Lewis. He had bought her a pair of small pearl earrings in a cardboard box and had planned to give them to her when he came home. Wallace already knew the young man would not come home. He did not yet know why. He only felt it, the way old investigators feel a case before the facts have caught up with them. Beside him stood Detective Harold Mercer of the Altoona Police Department, a local man with a square face, a heavy overcoat, and the kind of patience that comes from walking the same streets for 20 years. Mercer held an unlit cigarette between his fingers. He knew the cafe. Half the station knew it. He had eaten there himself after late shifts, sitting at the counter while Helen Carter poured coffee and moved through the narrow kitchen with her apron tied tight at the waist. People said her stew was the best between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. They said she simmered it for 3 days. Not as a joke, not as a slogan. 3 days. Low heat, big enamel pots, onions, potatoes, carrots, bay leaves, pepper, cheap cuts that became tender only if you were patient, and enough time to make men forget the rattle of the bus and the ache in their shoulders. She served it in thick white bowls with saltines on the side. Truck drivers talked about it. Conductors talked about it. Factory men talked about it. Too many people had trusted that counter. In less than an hour, Wallace would step through the front door of the Maple Yard Cafe. Before noon, a state forensic team would seal the kitchen, the storeroom, the basement steps, and the alley gate. By nightfall, a lab courier would leave for Harrisburg with evidence packed in brown paper and marked with initials. 2 days later, when the first results came back, the case would become something no local paper could print in full. Certain descriptions would be withheld. Certain exhibits would be sealed. Certain words would not be spoken in front of the families. But at 7:45 that morning, Wallace knew only one thing. 6 days earlier, a young police officer had stepped off a bus in Altoona to get something to eat. He had entered the Maple Yard Cafe. He had not been seen alive again. To understand how a narrow cafe beside a railroad station became a place that people in Pennsylvania whispered about for decades, you have to go back 5 years, to a coal town east of the Susquehanna, where the whole story began. Shamokin at the end of the 1960s was coal dust, row houses, church bells, and hills that looked wounded even in summer. The town lived under the memory of anthracite. It lived under the company names painted on brick walls, under the breaker towers, under the black grit that settled on windowsills and collar cuffs. Men went down before daylight and came home with their faces gray. Women washed work shirts until their hands cracked. Children played stickball in alleys where the air smelled of damp stone, stove smoke, and the river after rain. The houses were narrow, 2 stories high, pressed together like tired people in a line. Porches sagged. Kitchen radios played news, baseball, and weather reports. On Fridays, pay envelopes came home folded in lunch pails. On Sundays, church dresses and polished shoes appeared for a few hours. And then, Monday returned with the whistle. Helen Carter worked in the cafeteria at the Buck Ridge Coal Company office. She was 36 years old, small, lean, dark-haired, with shadows under her eyes that had stopped looking temporary. Her hands were red from hot water and soap powder. Her nails were clipped short. She wore plain house dresses under a white apron and tied her hair back with a scarf because the kitchen was always too warm. Helen had never been a pretty woman in the way people said it out loud, but her face was hard to forget. Sharp features, a still mouth, and calm eyes that made people lower their voices without knowing why. She cooked for miners, clerks, mechanics, and the office men who came downstairs at noon, pretending not to notice that the workers were served from the same pans. Soup, beans, fried potatoes, cafeteria meatloaf, canned peaches, coffee that sat too long on the burner. It was heavy work and plain work. She was at the back door before dawn. The first men came through before 6. The pots were too big, the floors too slick, the dish tubs too deep. There were never enough hands. Helen did not complain. She was not known for complaint. Women in the neighborhood said she was quiet, steady, and careful with $1. They also said she could make a meal out of almost nothing and make it taste like someone had cared. Her husband, Samuel Carter, worked the number 5 slope for Buck Ridge. He was 39, broad-shouldered, silent, and gentle in the old coal country way. He did not drink much, which made people call him lucky or odd, depending on who was speaking. Samuel came home, washed at the kitchen sink, ate whatever Helen put in front of him, fixed a chair leg, sharpened the mower blade, read the local paper, and went to bed. He loved his wife without speeches. Every payday he brought the envelope home unopened. He never struck her. On their daughter Diane's birthday, he took a bus to Sunbury and came back with a brown teddy bear from a department store. The bear had button eyes and one crooked ear. Diane called it Mr. Patch and slept with it long after she was too old to admit it. Diane was 9 in 1968. Thin, serious, and watchful, she had her mother's face, but her father's soft manner. She liked science best, especially anything about the body and how people healed. She wanted to be a nurse first, then a doctor, then a surgeon. After a visiting physician, spoke at school and told the class that steady hands mattered more than being born important. Every night, Helen sat beside her at the Formica table and looked over her homework. Helen had left school early and could not always help, but she watched Diane write, and that was enough. The girl kept writing because her mother was watching. The Carters were not happy in any grand way, but they were not ruined either. Samuel had a paycheck. Helen had her cafeteria wages. They rented half of a narrow house on Coal Street. The kitchen ceiling leaked in hard rain. The upstairs room was cold in winter, and the neighbor's radio came through the wall every Saturday night, but the rent was paid. There was food. Samuel did not gamble away the envelope. Diane was healthy. In a town like Shamokin, that counted as more than some families had. Everything ended on October 14, 1968. A little after 2 in the afternoon. Helen was standing over a pot of bean soup when a young mechanic came through the cafeteria door and shouted that there had been a collapse in the number 5 slope. She dropped the ladle and ran. She ran past the lockers, past the company trucks, past the coal yard, past men who were already taking off their caps because they knew. Women in coal towns know that run. Sooner or later, every one of them makes it, or sees someone else make it, and nobody has to explain what it means. At the mouth of the slope, people were gathered in a tight, frightened crowd. Dust still hung in the air. The rescue crew was pulling on gear, but their faces were already closed. The fall had happened deep enough that the first reports came back in fragments. 3 men had been trapped in a section where the roof had given way. Samuel Carter, Andrew Malone, and Henry Barlow. There had been no contact. The engineer estimated the air would not last as long as the rescue would take. Helen stood there until dark, then through the night. Someone brought coffee in a paper cup. She did not drink it. By the next afternoon, the company superintendent announced that the recovery effort had been suspended. The ground was unstable. Any further digging could bring down more roof. The families would receive payment through the company insurance and the state workmen's compensation process. Payment. That was the word they used. A few $100s for a life. For 39 years. For thousands of shifts under stone. For hands that had gone down clean enough in the morning and come home black at night. For a husband who had bought a teddy bear in Sunbury and carried it back on the bus like it was glass. A week after the memorial service, Helen went to the Buckridge office. There had been no body to bury in the way families understand burial. There was an empty casket, a hymn, a wooden marker, and the dirt turned over in a cemetery where too many coal families knew the same kind of lie. Helen wore a dark dress and the good shoes she usually saved for church. She climbed the stairs to the second floor and asked to see William Grayson. Grayson was 54, thick through the neck, red in the face, with thinning hair combed carefully over a pale scalp. He had managed Buck Ridge for 11 years. Under him, the company stayed profitable enough for the owners in Philadelphia to leave him alone. Men were hurt every year. Sometimes they died. The reports called it acceptable loss, preventable only in language no one intended to pay for. His office had a polished desk, a water glass, framed safety certificates, and a photograph of the governor shaking hands with company men. Helen sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap. She asked whether the compensation could be increased. She had a 9-year-old daughter. 1 cafeteria wage, rent, coal for the stove, school clothes. How was she supposed to live? Grayson looked at her over his glasses, tapped 2 fingers against the desk, and said the sentence Helen Carter would remember for the rest of her life. You knew what kind of work he did when you married him. The company has met its obligation. That is all. Helen stood. She did not shout. She did not cry. She closed the door behind her quietly. 6 months later, William Grayson would walk into a small cafe near the station in Altoona, recognize the former cafeteria woman, smirk as if fate had arranged a joke for his private amusement, order the stew, and never leave that place alive. But that was still ahead. After the meeting with Grayson, Helen changed in a way that did not show at first. She kept working. She cooked soup, washed dishes, checked Diane's school papers, scrubbed clothes in the sink, hung them on a line behind the house, and paid the rent. Outside, nothing had shifted. Inside, something had gone out, or something had come on, but it burned too far down for anyone to see. She spoke less. Before, she might stand on the porch and trade a few words with Mrs. Nolan next door about the price of eggs, or the pastor's sermon, or the latest foolishness from Harrisburg. Now she came home, made supper, sat by the kitchen window and looked into the alley. Just looked. Diane would ask, "Mom, are you all right?" Helen would smile and say, "I'm tired, honey, that's all." In the spring of 1969, Helen quit the cafeteria, packed 2 suitcases, Diane's teddy bear, an enamel pot, a cutting board, a small roll of kitchen tools, and the coffee can where she kept the last of Samuel's savings. She bought bus tickets west to Altoona. The neighbors asked why there? Why not Harrisburg? Why not Pittsburgh? Why not stay where people knew her? Helen said the air would be better for Diane, and there might be work near the station. That was partly true. It was not the whole truth. Altoona was a railroad town. People passed through it. Men came from Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Johnstown, Erie, Harrisburg, Cleveland, and small towns nobody remembered after the ticket was punched. Salesmen changed buses. Mechanics came for parts. Union men came for meetings. Factory buyers came with envelopes, checks, receipts, and cash, because old habits died slowly in companies that still trusted a man more than a bank wire. People ate, made phone calls, bought cigarettes, slept in cheap rooms, and moved on. A town like that could remember a face for an hour and forget it by nightfall. Helen found a failing lunch counter 2 blocks from the station. The widow who owned it wanted out. The place had a cracked tile floor, a narrow kitchen, a storeroom with a low ceiling, and the back door opening into an alley where trash cans froze shut in winter. Helen paid with savings, borrowed from a churchwoman who took pity on Diane, and signed papers she barely understood. She painted the door green and hung a hand-lettered sign, Maple Yard Cafe. There were 3 booths, 7 stools, a coffee urn, a griddle, 2 enamel stockpots, and an old icebox that rattled like a sick dog. She opened in June. The first months were hard. The station already had vending machines, a diner by the bus office, a hot dog cart near the corner, and a lunchroom that served eggs all day. Helen had almost no money. Some mornings she sold more coffee than food. Some nights she counted coins under the lamp and wondered whether she had made a mistake. But she knew one thing: stew. It was not fancy. It was not a restaurant dish. It was not a restaurant dish. It was not something a newspaper would review. It was the kind of food working men trusted because it looked poor and generous at the same time. Helen simmered it slowly. The first day was broth, vegetables, and patience. The second day it deepened. The third day it became the thing people remembered. She served it with bread, sometimes saltines, sometimes a scoop of mashed potatoes if she had them. She did not boast. She just set the bowl down and let the men talk for her. By the fall, drivers knew, porters knew, ticket clerks knew. A machinist told the conductor told the salesman told the foreman, and by winter there were days when the lunch crowd stood in the doorway waiting for a stool. A bowl of stew cost less than $1. Coffee was a dime. Pie, when she had it, was another quarter. Men came in cold, hungry, and irritated by delays. They left warmer, slower, and kinder than they had entered. Helen poured coffee, listened without seeming to listen, remembered names when it helped, and created the feeling that the Maple Yard was not a counter, but a kitchen in some house where a tired person was allowed to sit down. A young porter named Raymond Hill helped her carry flour, potatoes, coffee tins, and coal for the old stove. Raymond was 25, broad-handed, simple in the best sense, with a laugh people could hear half a block away. Helen paid him with meals and a few dollars when she could. He liked her. She was strict, but she never cheated him. She did not flirt, did not gossip, did not invite trouble. To Raymond, that made her respectable. He noticed sometimes that she worked late after closing. He saw brown paper bundles going out through the alley, tied tight and carried on a handcart. He assumed it was trash, spoiled supplies, kitchen waste, whatever a cafe had to get rid of. He had no reason to think otherwise. People see what fits their world. Across the street, Clara Whitaker ran a small newsstand beside the bus office. She was a large, talkative woman in her 40s, who sold newspapers, cigarettes, chewing gum, postcards, and paperback mysteries. Clara knew who was late on rent, which drivers drank too much, which ticket agents were stepping out, and which travelers looked lost enough to be sold a map. She noticed that men with sample cases sometimes went into the maple yard and did not come back past her stand. Not always. Not often enough to become a fact. Just enough to sit at the edge of her mind. Maybe they left through the alley, she thought. Maybe they caught a cab from the other side. Maybe she had looked down to count change and missed them. Clara had her own troubles. A husband with a bad liver, a son who had quit school, a landlord raising the rent, and winter coming. Other people's lunches were not her business. Diane entered school in Altoona and adjusted faster than Helen expected. Children can be cruel, but they can also be practical. If a girl knows how to jump rope, shares an eraser, and does not act proud, the question of where she came from becomes less important by Friday. Diane did well. She still wanted medicine. She still slept with Mr. Patch, though now the bear stayed under the blanket where nobody could see. Helen worked from before dawn until late night. She saw her daughter in slices. A breakfast plate left warm on the stove. A school paper signed at midnight. A note beside the bowl covered with a towel. "Eat, honey. I'll be back soon." Helen loved Diane. That was the only clean and unperformed feeling left in her after Samuel died. Everything else had become emotion. Smile at the customer, wipe the counter, count the drawer, bargain with the grocer, lock the back door. Take off the mask only after the last bus had gone and Diane was asleep. Who she was when the mask came off, no one knew. December of 1969 came down hard on Altoona. Wet snow packed along the curbs, turned black beneath bus tires, and froze again by night. The station smelled of wool coats, damp newspapers, diesel exhaust, and coffee. Business slowed. People hurried instead of lingering. Even the regulars kept their heads down. Helen simmered stew, fed the stove, and waited. She had waited 6 months from the day she left William Grayson's office and closed the door without a sound. 6 months is long enough for rage to stop being heat and become shape. Not panic, not a fit, not a moment of madness. Something colder than that. Something that could sit in a chair, pay bills, help a child with homework, and wait for the right man to walk into the right room. Grayson came to Altoona on December 19th. A company meeting, a supply dispute, papers to sign with a parts dealer near the rail yard. He traveled with a leather briefcase, an expense envelope, and the confidence of a man who had spent his life being obeyed by people who needed their jobs. He arrived in a brown overcoat and a fur hat that looked too expensive for the street he was on. He was heavier than Helen remembered, redder in the face, but the chin was the same. The eyes were the same. The look of ownership was the same. It was late afternoon. He saw the Maple Yard sign, pushed through the door, and stood stamping snow from his shoes. Helen came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She recognized him at once. Grayson did not recognize her until he had already sat down. Then his eyes narrowed. He smiled without warmth. "Well, I'll be," he said. "The Cole widow. You landed here?" Helen smiled the way she smiled at customers, friendly, blank, useful. "Good evening, Mr. Grayson. Stew and coffee?" He laughed as if she had told him a private joke. "Why not? Let's see if you cook better than you plead." There were no other customers. The snow had thickened and the buses were running late. Helen brought him stew, then coffee, then a second bowl because he asked for it. He talked about Buck Ridge, the men, the market, the trouble with unions, the trouble with widows who thought the world owed them more than the law allowed. Helen listened. She nodded. She warmed his coffee. She did not look toward the window where the street had emptied. What happened later was described in the court record only in the language necessary for conviction. A fatal confrontation occurred inside the closed cafe. The investigation established that Helen Carter acted deliberately. The rest belonged to sealed testimony, lab reports, and a line in Wallace's notebook that he never explained to anyone outside the case. By morning, Grayson was missing. His briefcase was gone. His appointments had been missed. The men waiting for him assumed first that he had been delayed by weather, then that he had gone drinking, then that he had found a woman, then that he had taken the money and run. That last theory became convenient. It fit the facts people wanted to fit. He had traveled with cash. He had been seen near the station. He had not checked into the hotel. A man with enemies and money can disappear in ways that make people stop looking too closely. The local police took a report. Buck Ridge made phone calls. The company did not want scandal. No widow from Shamokin was considered important enough to become part of the story. Helen opened the cafe the next morning as usual. Coffee by 6, oatmeal for a ticket clerk, stew by noon. Nobody noticed anything except that the place was warm. Under a loose board in the room behind the kitchen, Helen placed the money she had taken from Grayson. She counted it once, then again, then put it away. It was more than the company had placed on Samuel's life. More than Helen had seen in one place. More than grief, if grief could be counted in bills. For the next half year, she spent almost none of it. She paid suppliers, bought Diane's school shoes, replaced the cracked pane near the counter, sent a little extra to the landlord. The rest stayed hidden. The cafe ran as before. The stew simmered. People came, people left. Life, from the sidewalk, appeared ordinary. But inside Helen, the first death had changed the arrangement of the world. She looked at certain men differently now. Men with briefcases, men with cash envelopes, men who put their elbows wide on the counter and spoke to her as if she were an appliance that poured coffee. Men who called her sweetheart without knowing her name. Men who complained about prices while leaving no tip. Men who assumed that a woman behind a counter had no memory and no power to answer them. They were not all William Grayson. Helen knew that if she let herself know it. But grief had built a room inside her, where every man with money and confidence began to look like the same man. They came in, took space, expected warmth, and went on. Samuel had not been like them. Samuel had gone underground and never come back, because men like Grayson had called risk acceptable. The second was Edward Price, a textile buyer from Lancaster, 38 years old, neat, married, polite, with a narrow mustache and a sample case full of invoices. He was traveling toward Pittsburgh to settle a fabric order and carried company funds because his employer still preferred a man with an envelope to a bank delay. He entered the Maple Yard on a hot evening in June of 1970. He ordered stew and iced tea. He spoke kindly. He did not raise his voice. He mentioned his wife, Margaret, and 2 children, Daniel and Ruth. He asked whether there was a payphone nearby because he always called home when he changed buses. He did not make the call from Altoona. Later, investigators would conclude that he had been incapacitated before the fatal act occurred. They did not explain the method in open court. They did not need to. The proof was in the pattern, the records, the missing funds, and Helen's own statement. Price's employer filed a report. His wife wrote letters. Police traced his route as far as Altoona, then lost him in the ordinary confusion of a station town. People got off buses, changed seats, bought sandwiches, took cabs, met strangers, changed their minds. A missing man with cash could be a thief, a runaway, a victim, or a rumor. The file grew thin and cold. Margaret Price set a place for him at the table for months. Their son quit baseball. Their daughter stopped sleeping through the night. Those details never reached Helen. Or if they did in some form, she did not let them remain human. If someone had noticed then that William Grayson and Edward Price had both vanished after passing through Altoona with money, 9 lives might have turned in another direction. But no one noticed. Pennsylvania was full of towns. The country was full of roads. Men traveled. Men lied. Men disappeared. Paper reports sat in separate drawers. The third and fourth were 2 men from a National Guard supply office, Paul Klein and Robert Sanders. February of 1971. Klein was 40, loud, broad, with a wedding band he turned when he talked. Sanders was 27, quieter, newly promoted, embarrassed by Klein's jokes. They were traveling together with requisition papers and a cash advance for a uniform contractor in Pittsburgh. They had already been drinking when they entered the Maple Yard. Helen saw them as a test before she had the word for it. 2 men, not one. 2 voices. 2 coats hung on the back of the booth. 2 sets of documents. The open record says only that both men were last seen near the station and that their disappearance was first treated as misconduct. Because they were military supply men, the questions went farther than they had with Price. Officers came through Altoona. They asked at the ticket windows, the hotel desk, the bar around the corner, the cafe. Helen looked at the photographs, frowned, and said she could not say. A lot of men came through. Some wore uniforms, some did not. She served whoever sat down. The investigator who questioned her ordered coffee before leaving. He paid, thanked her, and walked out with no suspicion at all. Klein's wife lost benefits for a time because paperwork suggested desertion or theft. Sanders's mother refused to believe the accusation and kept writing to offices until the letters came back with nothing useful. Years later, after the truth emerged, both men were cleared. That did not give anyone back the years spent under suspicion. By the end of 1971, Helen had more money under the floor than Samuel Carter had earned in many years. She bought Diane a winter coat, a better school bag, a used typewriter for practice, and a set of anatomy flashcards from a second-hand bookstore. Diane was growing tall and serious. She still wanted medicine. Helen told her to study hard and not let anyone make her small. The 5th was Arthur Bell, a traveling clothing wholesaler from Youngstown, 43, cheerful, vain, with cologne that entered a room before he did, and the gold-colored tie clip he touched when he laughed. He came in October of 1972 with a garment bag, a sales ledger, and enough cash to make Helen's eyes pause for 1 second too long. He praised the stew too loudly, called her darling, tipped more than anyone at the counter had tipped in months, and asked whether there was a clean room nearby because he had missed his connection. Helen said she knew of a room behind the cafe, warm enough, plain enough, $1 and change. He accepted. The next day, nobody in Pittsburgh met him. His wife Elaine waited for a call. His daughters asked when Daddy was bringing the dresses he had promised. Weeks passed. Because Bell had been known to make side deals and stretch accounts, some people assumed he had run off with inventory money. His file never received the urgency his family begged for. That same summer, Clara Whitaker saw something that could have changed everything. It was close to 4 in the morning, and she had not slept because of a toothache. She sat on the step of her newsstand with a scarf around her shoulders, holding a cloth against her jaw. The alley behind the Maple Yard was visible beneath the street lamp. Helen came out pushing the handcart. Something wrapped in brown paper and tied with cord lay on it, heavy enough to make the wheels complain. Clara watched Helen move down the alley toward the service lot. She watched until the darkness took her. In the morning, Clara walked into the cafe intending to ask. Helen was washing cups in a metal basin. A folded dish towel lay flat near the sink. Helen's face was calm. Too calm, Clara would later say. Clara opened her mouth, looked at Helen's hands, and changed her question into an order for coffee. People mind their own business in a town like that, Clara told Wallace in her statement. Or they tell themselves they do. She signed the statement with a shaking hand. Around that same period, Helen visited Diane in Harrisburg. Diane had earned a place in a nursing program connected to a hospital school. She lived in a dormitory room with 2 other girls, a narrow bed, a metal desk, and the photograph of Samuel Carter tucked into the frame of her mirror. Helen took the train, brought a jar of peaches, a tin of cookies, and $30 folded inside an envelope. She stayed in a cheap hotel because she wanted clean sheets, a private bathroom, and one night without the smell of fryer grease in her hair. For 3 days, mother and daughter walked along the river, ate grilled cheese at a lunch counter, and looked at store windows they could not afford. Diane talked about anatomy, night shifts, the head nurse who frightened everyone, and the possibility of becoming more than people expected from a coal miner's daughter. Helen listened and smiled. On the platform before leaving, she held Diane a moment too long. "You keep going," Helen said. "I'll make sure you have what you need." On the ride back to Altoona, Helen sat by the window and watched the dark hills pass. Men in the seats behind her played cards. A child cried 2 rows ahead. The train beat out its rhythm beneath her feet. Helen thought of tuition, rent, books, uniforms, food, a future apartment for Diane, maybe a car someday. Things Samuel's wages could never have bought. Things no compensation office had thought a miner's widow deserved. Helen knew where money came from now. A month after returning from Harrisburg, Arthur Bell disappeared. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And now, let's keep going. The 6th was George Whitman, owner of a small machine shop outside Cleveland, 51, tall, spare, with a soldier's posture and the veteran's habit of folding his coat before sitting down. He came in March of 1973 for a meeting with a railroad parts supplier. He was not a flashy man. He had a war ribbon in a drawer at home, a wife named Claudia, and a daughter who had just started college. A taxi driver told him the Maple Yard had the best stew in town. Whitman came in, ate, ordered coffee, and asked whether he could wait there until his appointment. Helen said of course. Whitman was the first disappearance that nearly touched her. His business partners pushed hard. Police retraced his route, interviewed cab drivers, clerks, porters, motel owners, and anyone who might have seen him. They came to the Maple Yard with his photograph. Helen looked at it carefully and shook her head. "I don't remember him," she said. "A lot of men come through." The officer wrote it down. He had no reason to suspect a woman with a clean apron and tired eyes. Before he left, he bought pie wrapped in wax paper for the road. Claudia Whitman came to Altoona herself 3 times. She carried her husband's photograph in a black purse and asked questions until people began to avoid her. Once she sat in the Maple Yard, at the booth where George had sat, and ate the stew because she was hungry and exhausted and did not know. Helen served her. Helen knew. She stood behind the counter and watched Claudia lift the spoon with both hands trembling. Claudia went home with nothing. Within a year, her hair had gone white around the temples. Every evening, she placed a plate at the table for George and cleared it untouched. A habit like that is not hope. It is the shape hope leaves after it dies. Between Whitman and the final victim, there were 5 more men. Their names were reconstructed later from documents found under the floor, from reports in other counties, from Helen's statements, and from families who had never stopped calling offices. Michael Rowe, a civil engineer from State College traveling to a conference with survey papers and travel funds. Thomas Allen, an accountant from Reading carrying payroll records for a construction firm. 2 site foremen, Walter Jenkins from Johnstown and Calvin Morris from Wheeling, gone within weeks of each other while moving between jobs. And Henry Foster, a warrant officer traveling on leave, with a scarf for his wife and a doll for his little girl. Each stopped in Altoona. Each entered the Maple Yard. Each had a reason to trust a counter, a bowl, a woman who looked like someone's aunt, mother, neighbor, or church lady. Each became a missing person file in a different office. Each left behind people who had to decide whether to grieve, accuse, wait, or go mad from not knowing. 11 men in 5 years. 11 families. 11 separate reports. No single list. No shared database that could pull one fact from Erie, one from Lancaster, one from Cleveland, one from Johnstown, one from the guard office, and place them side by side on a desk. There were phone calls, carbon copies, index cards, local memories, and investigators carrying too many cases at once. There were assumptions. Men with money run off. Men with debts hide. Men with wives lie. Men who travel get lost. Men who vanish near stations become stories people tell over coffee until the next shift starts. And there was a cafe near the tracks where the stew simmered for 3 days, and Helen Carter smiled at everyone who came in. By 1973, Helen looked older than 40. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Lines had deepened around her mouth. Her hands were rough, swollen at the knuckles, marked by burns and old cuts from honest kitchen work, and from things the public record did not fully describe. She had grown thinner. Her eyes had become dark wells people did not look into for long. Customers did not notice. To them, she was the woman behind the counter, a function. Coffee, stew, change, a napkin, a word of comfort that cost nothing. She never chose more than a few victims in a year. Never the same day of the week. Never the same hour. Never in a way that made a pattern visible to anyone standing outside her mind. The choice was practical. Alone, traveling, carrying money, expected elsewhere but not immediately. The kind of man whose absence would first be mistaken for misconduct, delay, or selfishness. The system did not fail once. It failed repeatedly, in small, ordinary ways. The 12th broke it. Not because Helen changed her method, not because she became careless in the visible sense. She chose the wrong man. She chose someone whose absence triggered the right alarm in the right office at the right time. April of 1974 in Altoona smelled of thawing pavement, wet brick, diesel, and the first grass along the tracks. The maples near the station had pale green edges. The newsstand reopened its front flap after winter. Bus drivers stood outside without gloves. Clara Whitaker sold the morning paper, with Watergate headlines folded above the crease and local stories buried beneath them. Officer Kevin Moore arrived on April 17th, traveling from Erie toward a police training class near Harrisburg. He was young enough to still look proud of his uniform, and old enough to hide it badly. He carried a small suitcase, a shaving kit, a training packet, and a cardboard jewelry box for Janet Lewis. He was not carrying a fortune. He had a few $100 in travel money, a paycheck cashed before leaving, and the earrings. To Helen, that was enough. To the system, he was different from every man before him. Moore stepped off the bus during a layover and asked the driver where to get a real meal. The driver pointed toward the Maple Yard. 2 blocks, he said. Green sign. Get the stew. Moore entered around 5 in the afternoon. Helen was behind the counter, wiping a cup. Raymond Hill had just dropped off potatoes and was leaving by the alley. Clara saw the young man pass her stand. She noticed the uniform jacket folded over his arm and thought he looked like a boy dressed for a school photograph. Inside, Moore sat at the counter and ordered stew, coffee, and pie if she had any. Helen served him. He thanked her twice. He told her he was on his way to training. He said his fiancée hated when he missed meals, so he had better eat something decent before calling her. He asked whether the payphone in the station worked or if it still ate dimes. Helen told him the one near the men's room worked better. He laughed. "I'll try my luck." He did not make the call. At some point, Helen offered him more coffee. The investigation later established that Moore was incapacitated while inside the café. The precise details were not repeated in public filings. A fatal act followed. What mattered in court was intent, concealment, and the evidence that tied the café to the disappearance. Helen locked the front door after closing. She lit the back lamp. It was the 12th night. It was also the last. She did not know two things. First, Kevin Moore was a police officer in active service, not a salesman, buyer, foreman, or company man whose absence might be explained away. Second, he was expected by name at registration the next morning. When he did not appear, a clerk called Erie. Erie called the training office. The training office called the Transportation Police, then the Pennsylvania State Police. By noon, his route was being reconstructed. By evening, the bus driver remembered Altoona. The driver remembered saying, "Green sign, get the stew." On April 19th, Detective Mercer walked into the Maple Yard with Moore's photograph. Helen looked at it. Her face did not change. "He might have come in," she said. "A lot of men do. I don't keep track unless they cause trouble." Mercer ordered coffee so he could sit a while. He watched the room, the back door, the way Helen moved between counter and kitchen, the way she did not ask too many questions. He left without proof, but not without unease. Outside, Clara Whitaker was closing her stand. Mercer showed her the photograph. Clara charged Moore at once. "He went in there," she said. "Late afternoon. Uniform over his arm. I remember because he looked too young to be tired already." That was the first crack. The second came from Raymond Hill. Mercer found him at the freight platform, lifting boxes with another porter. Raymond did not want trouble. He liked Helen. She fed him. She had never done him wrong. But when Mercer asked about the night Moore vanished, Raymond remembered leaving by the alley and seeing Helen watching him go with a look he had not understood at the time. He also mentioned, almost apologetically, the brown paper bundles he had seen over the years. "Kitchen trash," he said. "I figured that's all it was." Mercer took the statement to Wallace. Wallace had been through enough investigations to know that two small facts can weigh more than one dramatic accusation. A missing officer, a witness placing him in the café, a second witness describing late-night removals, a café owner who had once lived in Shamokin, where a company superintendent named William Grayson had vanished after traveling with cash. Wallace did not yet see the whole shape, but he saw the edge of it. They pulled old reports. Not all at once. Nothing was easy. Phone calls, teletype messages, courthouse clerks, company offices, police departments that had to be convinced this was not a fishing trip. By April 22nd, Wallace had a list that made his office go quiet. Grayson, Price, Klein, Sanders, Bell, Whitman, Rowe, Allen, Jenkins, Morris, Foster, Moore. Different cities, different reasons to travel, different employers, different investigators. One shared point that had been invisible until someone asked the right question. Altoona. Station District. Maple Yard Café. The warrant was signed before dawn. At 7:45 on April 23rd, Wallace crossed the street with Mercer, two uniformed officers, and the county assistant district attorney. Helen had just turned the sign in the window to open. The coffee urn steamed. A pot simmered on the stove. She looked up as the bell over the door rang. "Morning," she said. Wallace showed the warrant. For the first time anyone could remember, Helen Carter did not smile. The search lasted all day. Customers were turned away. The front door was taped. The kitchen, storeroom, basement steps, alley, stove area, floorboards, shelves, and ledgers were photographed and marked. Neighbors gathered across the street, until a patrolman told them to move along. Clara stood by her newsstand and cried without making a sound. Raymond sat on a crate behind the station and kept rubbing his hands on his pants as if they were dirty. Under a loose section of flooring in the room behind the kitchen, investigators found cash, identification papers, business cards, receipts, military documents, a tie clip, a watch, a ring, travel vouchers, small personal objects, and the cardboard jewelry box with pearl earrings inside. Each item was bagged, labeled, and placed on a growing table of evidence. Wallace watched the table fill and felt the case move from suspicion into something heavier than anger. The kitchen findings were handled separately. Experts worked without bystanders. Certain material was removed for laboratory testing. The open report later used careful language. Prohibited biological traces. Material incompatible with a food product. Evidence that should never have entered a commercial kitchen. The public did not need more. The families did not need more. The court did not need harsher words to establish the truth. Helen sat at a booth while they searched. She wore her apron. Her hands rested flat on the table. She did not ask for a lawyer until late afternoon. She did not ask what they had found. Once, when Wallace placed the jewelry box on the evidence table, Helen closed her eyes. "Who did those belong to?" Mercer asked. Helen opened her eyes. "The last one." It was the first admission. They took her to the station after dark. A crowd had gathered by then. People stared as if expecting something inhuman, and seeing only a small, middle-aged woman in a work dress. Someone shouted. Someone crossed himself. Someone else whispered that she had served him coffee last week. Helen kept her eyes forward. The interrogation began before midnight and continued into the next day with breaks, counsel present after she requested it, and a stenographer taking down what could be taken down. Helen spoke quietly. No tears, no shaking, no performance. Wallace asked about William Grayson. She answered. He asked about Edward Price. She answered. One by one, the names came forward. Some she remembered clearly, some by object. The man with the gold-colored tie clip, the man with the guard papers, the quiet one with the family photograph, the young officer with the earrings. Why? Wallace asked. Helen looked at him as if the question were not difficult, only late. They all came in thinking the world was theirs, she said. They took what they wanted and went on. Edward Price was married, polite. His children waited for him. He had money, Helen said. My husband worked 10 years and never saw that kind of money in his hand. Kevin Moore had a few $100s. For the first time, Helen looked away. Her eyes moved to a photograph of Diane that officers had taken from her room and placed with personal property. That one was a mistake, she said. I didn't know he was police. It was the only sentence that sounded close to regret, not remorse. Regret, the way a factory worker might speak of a part cut wrong. Wallace went back to his motel room near the highway after dawn. The coffee in the room was undrinkable. The bed was untouched. He sat at the small desk and wrote until his hand cramped. He thought about the earrings in the box, about Janet Lewis waiting in Erie, about Claudia Whitman eating at the booth, about his own meal at the Maple Yard 2 nights earlier when he had come through asking questions, and Helen Carter had refilled his cup. The case did not vanish into secrecy the way things did in other countries, but it did become narrower in public than it was in fact. The district attorney asked the judge to seal certain evidentiary descriptions before trial. The court agreed. The newspapers printed what they could. Cafe owner charged. Missing man linked. State police investigate station district deaths. They did not print the worst phrases, because the worst phrases were not released. Helen Carter was a widow, a mother, a cook, a business owner, and the accused in 12 killings over 5 years. No headline could hold all of that without becoming a lie. The investigation lasted 2 months. The state lab processed the kitchen evidence. The county coroner reviewed what could be reviewed. Search teams examined the service lot and other disposal sites named in Helen's statement. But many findings were incomplete, degraded, or legally useful only in connection with the documents under the floor. In the end, the strongest evidence was not the thing people whispered about. It was paper, receipts, identification, personal effects, cash, travel timelines, witnesses, Helen's own words. Diane was questioned in Harrisburg. She was 19, in nursing school, pale from crying, and so frightened that the detective interviewing her stopped twice to get water. She said she knew nothing. Her mother told her the cafe did well. Her mother sent money. Her mother worked hard. That was all. Investigators confirmed it. Diane had not been part of the crimes. She had believed the story any daughter would want to believe, that her mother had endured loss and built a living honestly. Raymond Hill was interviewed 3 times. He told them about the deliveries, the late hours, the bundles he thought were trash. Clara Whitaker told them about the alley, the men, the morning she almost asked. The taxi driver remembered Whitman. A bus driver remembered Moore. A clerk remembered Bell's garment bag. A widow remembered the phone call that never came. Everyone had seen a piece. No one had seen the picture. The trial opened in July of 1974 in the Blair County Court of Common Pleas. It was not fully closed, but the judge restricted portions of testimony and sealed several exhibits. The courtroom was smaller than the case deserved, and more crowded than the families could bear. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder. Some relatives came, some could not. Janet Lewis did not attend the first day. She sent Moore's older brother instead, and he sat with his jaw clenched until the lunch recess, then went outside and was sick behind the courthouse. Judge Margaret Lawson presided. She was 55, silver-haired, precise, and known for stopping lawyers before they fell in love with their own voices. The district attorney, Charles Bennett, read the indictment slowly. 12 counts of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, theft, obstruction. Related charges attached to documents, property, and concealment. After each name, he paused. The pauses became unbearable. Helen sat at the defense table in a gray dress with her hair pinned back. She looked smaller than she had in the cafe. Her attorney, Martin Doyle, tried to build the only defense available. Grief, trauma, the mind collapse, humiliation, poverty, a mind bent by loss. He requested psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation found that Helen understood her actions, understood wrongfulness, and had acted with planning. Doyle's shoulders seemed to drop after that. He still argued. That was his duty. But everyone in the room knew what the center of the case had become. When Helen testified, her answers were short. Yes, William Grayson had come into the cafe. Yes, she had recognized him. Yes, the other men had entered over the years. Yes, she had taken money. Yes, she knew families were waiting. No, Diane did not know. No, no one helped her. No, she did not want to explain the kitchen in front of the families. Judge Lawson allowed that answer to stand. At one point, the district attorney asked whether she understood what her customers had trusted when they sat down at her counter. Helen looked toward the jury, then toward the floor. They trusted me to feed them, she said. No one spoke for several seconds. The court reporter's keys stopped, then began again. Before sentencing, Judge Lawson gave Helen the chance to speak. Helen stood, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked not at the jury, not at the families, but at the judge. My husband is still under that mountain, she said. They told me the company had met its obligation. That was the word. Obligation. I had a child and a room with a leaking ceiling. The man who said it walked into my place and laughed. After that, I stopped believing there was a law for people like me. That is all I have. She sat down. The jury found her guilty on all counts. Because of the legal uncertainty around capital punishment in Pennsylvania at that time, the sentence became consecutive life terms and additional prison time on related charges. The district attorney said later he had sought the maximum the law would sustain. Helen was sent to the Women's State Correctional Institution at Muncie. She was 42 years old. Doyle, her attorney, left the courthouse after sentencing and sat on a bench across the street for nearly an hour. He had defended men who had done terrible things. He had argued cases he did not personally believe. But this case lodged somewhere he could not remove. He later told no one, but in his private notes, he wrote one sentence. I could not decide whether pity was a sin here. Charles Bennett, the district attorney, went home that night, stood in his kitchen, and watched his wife stir a pot on the stove. She asked whether he wanted dinner. He said yes, then changed his mind and asked for toast. He never told her why. The Maple Yard Cafe was demolished within weeks. The landlord claimed the building had become impossible to rent, and perhaps that was true. A bulldozer took down the back wall first. By winter, the lot held a temporary newspaper kiosk and a bench where bus passengers smoked between departures. The green sign disappeared. People said it had been burned. Others said it sat in a police storage room. Wallace never found out which was true. The case file remained partly sealed. Not hidden in the absolute sense, not erased, but narrowed, boxed, and made difficult. Families received more than the newspapers, less than the whole. Investigators moved on. Mercer retired in the late 70s and bought a small house near a lake. He never ate stew again. Wallace reached the rank of major and left the state police in the mid-80s. In his garage, his wife found 2 boxes of notebooks tied with string. The Maple Yard case filled half of one notebook. The last line read, 3 days on the stove. Now I understand why I could smell it in my sleep. When parts of the case became accessible again years later, the country had changed enough that the story seemed to belong to another America. The old station district had new signs. The Greyhound office had moved. The paper kiosk was gone. People who had eaten at the Maple Yard were grandparents. Some insisted they had always felt something wrong there. That was memory protecting itself. Most had felt nothing at all. Diane Carter became a nurse, then a physician assistant in a clinic outside Harrisburg. She did not marry. She did not have children. She lived carefully, quietly, and under a name that made it easier not to answer questions. Those who worked with her described her as disciplined, kind with patients, and unwilling to attend potluck dinners. She died of a stroke many years later. Among her belongings was one photograph, Helen and Diane in Shamokin, before the mine collapse. Diane was a small girl pressed against her mother's side. Helen was younger, not yet hard in the eyes. On the back, in Helen's handwriting, it said, "For my Diane, Mom." The earrings Kevin Moore bought for Janet Lewis remained in evidence until the sealed property review. By then, Janet had married, raised children, and become a school secretary in Erie. When the box was returned, she opened it once in a courthouse hallway. The pearl earrings were still fastened to the little card. She closed the box and placed it in her purse. Her husband asked later what she planned to do with them. She said, nothing. She never opened the box again. Margaret Price lived long enough to learn the truth about Edward. She received a certificate, an apology from no one in particular, and a folder of copies. She stood in a municipal hallway holding the papers and found she could not cry. Tears require a beginning. Hers had been spent over decades of not knowing. Claudia Whitman died before George's name was cleared. Until the end, she set a plate for him on certain evenings. Not every night by then, but often enough that her daughter stopped trying to correct her. Paul Klein's children grew up under the shadow of a false accusation. Robert Sanders's mother kept his letters in a Bible. Elaine Bell read the renewed article about the case and said, according to her niece, "So he didn't leave us." Then she folded the paper and asked for coffee. Each of the 12 deserves more than a line in an indictment. Michael Rowe, the civil engineer from State College, was 44. He built bridges and retaining walls and carried a slide rule in a leather case polished by his thumb. His wife, Vera, saved every postcard he sent from the road. From Altoona, no postcard came. When the case reopened, the slide rule was returned. Vera placed it in the same candy tin as the postcards. Thomas Allen, the accountant from Reading, was 36, shy, nearsighted, and responsible for his mother and younger brother. His mother went to the police station once a month for years. She asked whether there was news. There was never news. She died before the answer arrived. His brother came to Altoona afterward, found the empty lot, stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, and left without speaking to anyone. Walter Jenkins from Johnstown had a laugh people remembered before they remembered his face. He drank too much, worked hard, and owed money to men he should not have owed. For that reason, his disappearance was too easily explained away. Calvin Morris from Wheeling had 4 children and a wife who sent him off with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Jenkins entered the cafe because he wanted coffee, and maybe something stronger afterward. Morris entered because he wanted a hot meal before the next job. The result was the same. Henry Foster, the warrant officer traveling on leave, carried a scarf for his wife and a doll for his daughter. His unit confirmed he had left. His wife waited a week, then wrote letters, then waited in a different way. She eventually remarried, divorced, and drifted through life with a grief no one around her understood, because the facts had not yet arrived. The doll never reached the little girl. Years later, a damaged store receipt was enough to connect the purchase to the man who had carried it. And then there was William Grayson, the first. It would be easy to say he caused the rest, but that would be another lie. Grayson was cruel. Grayson treated a widow like a line item. Grayson spoke a sentence that lodged in Helen Carter like a nail. But 11 other men did not make Samuel die. 11 other families did not sign the company forms. Grief explains the door. It does not excuse walking through it again and again. That is the part of the Maple Yard case that makes it harder than the rumors. Not the sealed evidence, not the kitchen, not the things people still lower their voices to discuss. The hardest truth was simpler and more ordinary. Evil did not arrive wearing a mask. It wore an apron. It poured coffee. It called men honey without meaning it. It offered warmth to travelers who had no reason to be afraid of a bowl, a counter, or a woman who looked tired enough to be trustworthy. The station district in Altoona looks different now. New storefronts, new pavement, different buses, brighter signs. People pass the block without knowing what stood there. There is no marker for the Maple Yard Cafe, no plaque, no warning, only a file in county storage, a few newspaper clippings, sealed exhibits, and the memory of a green sign by the tracks. Helen Carter died at Muncie before she could be considered for any meaningful mercy. In the prison infirmary record, her occupation was listed as cook. No further comment. She left no confession beyond the transcript, no apology that anyone believed, no letter to Diane that Diane kept. Her name survived because the case survived. That is not justice. It is only record-keeping. If there is anything to learn from the case, it is not about food, and it is not about cleverness, and it is not about fear of strangers in roadside cafes. It is about the terrible power of ordinary trust. A man sits down because he is hungry. A woman behind the counter smiles because that is her job. A town moves around them, busy with newspapers, buses, payphones, weather, rent, and the next shift. Everyone thinks the world is still holding together because the coffee is hot and the sign says open. For 12 men, it was not. For 12 families, the sentence never really ended. And for everyone who ever passed the Maple Yard Cafe and thought it was only a place to get warm before the next bus, the truth arrived too late. Written in careful language, sealed in folders, and softened because some facts are not made more true by being said more plainly.